First, I want to support the accusations against the global sex industry. And I want most clearly to address the jury that we have to come to agreement about this, and we have to be clear of our arguments and clear of our facts. I want particularly to point out that the global sex industry, you need it closer? Yeah. How's that? Better. I want most clearly to point out that the global sex industry is overwhelming, is overpowering our government, our community, and ourselves. It's not just individual acts and individual Johns, but also a global sex industry. Observe the sheer numbers of men. Some say 1 in 8 are purchasing sex. Observe that the men of all nations and all classes are demanding the right to buy sex. They are buying sex. We know that the men of the North and the West are buying all over the world from women of all classes and races because they have the wealth and the power to do so. There is a hierarchy of exploitation based mostly on sex, class, and race, and therefore a hierarchy of responsibility based on that same hierarchy. The amount of profit being exploited in the sex industry is unfathomable. The harm, even with the personal witnesses that we're hearing, the harm is still mostly untold. The industry is a system, not just a collection of individuals or individual events of exploitation, but a set of human relations, destructive human relations, and miserable, exploitative human processes. I say that prostitution trafficking is best thought of as a form of violence against women. That is a control mechanism exercising control over all women. As in other forms of violence against women, prostitution trafficking is a force created by the individual acts of each man against each woman, but the aggregation or the sum of those individual parts is a much greater thing. A complex set of human relations, a much stronger structure, a more formidable force of repression. We know from more than 40 years of observing and fighting to end wife assault and rape, that each act of sexist violence combines to create a force that terrorizes not only that particular battered, raped, or prostituted woman in her present and into her future, but it also makes of her subjugation an example with which to terrorize even those women who were not attacked, who were not battered, not raped this time, not this time brought to our knees. Each successful act of violence against women, against each woman and each girl, does so. Each patriarchal retelling of that story of subjugation becomes a cautionary tale, a compelling warning, a warning that we might be next to be battered or raped, to have our children seduced, to have ourselves or our daughters sold. We observe too that women who are trapped by disability, by poverty and racism are more vulnerable to men who would abuse. They have less escape routes, fewer protectors, fewer safeguards. These women are chosen for that sexist abuse. Women left with the care of dependents, the old, the young, the sick, the needy, will be chosen because many will endure violence against women rather than abandon their responsibilities to their dependents. This is as true in prostitution as in other forms of sexist violence, from incest to the abuse of old women. We know too that each act of violence against women punishes women for acts of freedom. You are acting like a dyke, he will say. You are being a slut, or you should not have dared to be out in public at night, to dress like that, to flirt, or to be such an angry bitch. You are an unfit mother, he will say, when she refuses to submit in front of her children. or you are a disobedient daughter when she reveals his incest. You could have been safe if only you worked for a pimp, or took long enough to observe through the car window, or worked indoors and did what you were told. Alone, we fight each man against unequal physical, economic, and social strength. In such ways, violence against women is a force that controls individual women, preventing their exercise of freedom. Many women are forced to give up their access to the public sphere, including their access to public resources and their access to a public and therefore political life. Violence against women is a force that prevents women from forming and acting as a group to advance. Together in public life, we make demands both in our communities and at the ballot box. We can and do demand that Aboriginal land claims must be settled, that police come when called by poor women as well as by wealthy women, that men share in the caring work privately, but also share by supporting public childcare, health care, education. We can demand that men share the wealth of the planet with guaranteed livable incomes for each of us so that no woman lives dependent. Collectively, we can insist that borders must allow women to immigrate and that natural resources are not for corporate exploitation and destruction. Collectively, we can enforce legislation that forbids men from exploiting women and children. Violence against women, including in the form of prostitution, prevents women individually and collectively from accessing freedom, from creating freedom, from fighting for freedom. Violence against women, including prostitution, is both a cause and a result of women's oppression and must be abolished. But what is the sex industry beyond the violence of each man? The industry itself is made up of workers, customers, promoters, owners, developers, of miserable human relations and social and economic processes, with women as the raw material and prostitutes as the created objects, in which the hypersexualization of girls is a necessary industrial process, and human relations are reduced to those of buyers and sellers. But there are observers and witnesses in social processes too. Girls watching are taught what to expect of acts of freedom, of sexual relations. They're forewarned of sexual and economic and social relations to come. They and we become the prostituted. In spite of feminism, women's liberation is not yet at hand. We are all living in the belly of the beast of patriarchy. In the continued colonization, Aboriginal girls and women are served up as targets for men's sexualized rage, on reserve and off. Driven from home and land by incest, wife assault, and rape, Aboriginal women are trucked to and ghettoized in urban, impoverished, red light districts, forced to live in public, and too often rendered available to curb crawlers as street women. In the liberatory work of feminism of the last 4 decades, we as a movement have opened education and jobs, sexual rights and reproductive rights to many women, but we did not succeed in pressing the individual men in our lives in either Quebec or Canada to equally share the work of caring for our parents, our children, each other, or our communities. Just as we achieved those few changes for women, a new globalization of capital and a new global imperialism stole as many options away and opened a chasm of economic differences between women. As we women in Canada and Quebec became less compliant with sexism, less constrained in our choices, the men in our lives refused to embrace the social transformation to equal households and an egalitarian sexuality. They still demand that women, any women, women under control, care for the babies, the old, the sick, the house, and the imagined emotional and sexual needs of men. Unable to press us any further because of the women's movement, they have lent their voices, their political support, their votes to the government-supported profiteering processes that colonize the women of the First Nations and that import women of the Third World to do those acts of work and submission. Guest worker and domestic worker programs in which Philippine nannies and Latino domestic workers and the Caribbean aides in the old age homes work without pay equity, without the rights of a citizen or any future as a citizen, but also work with the constant threat of sexual exploitation. They do men's share of the caring work, and sometimes our share, in order to send home paychecks for their children to the lands from which corporations continue to export the resources, even the women. We watch the Eastern European strippers, the Asian massage parlor workers, the Black escorts, knowing that poorer women, racialized women, are pressed into the squalid act of feeding male egos and satisfying a distorted masculine sexuality from which we have ourselves barely or only partially escaped. Let us talk about the profiteers and their hold on our government. Sex trafficking for the purposes of prostitution is now a global trade larger than the traffic for cheap manufacturing labor and larger than the economy of many countries. The sex industry makes common cause with other global profit-making systems of patriarchy. Those systems cooperate to reduce and undermine any power of our governments to regulate and limit, to control or refuse the meanness of capitalism. Neoliberalism buys our government and reshapes it to serve profit makers, not women. Since 1995, in the pan-Canadian context, unevenly but steadily, corporate forces have dictated and restructured our governments. We have lost the right to livable welfare monies, to progressive immigration policies, to labor rights and adequate wages, to pension security and legal aid programs, to childcare and old age homes and funds for women's groups. We are offered the decriminalization of prostitution instead of income security. Increasingly, the government refuses to protect women from any sexist violence, saying to us and to the courts that it's up to each woman alone to choose a safe man, a safe job, a safe place to live, to create for herself safe working conditions, as though any of us could detect where and when and who among the men will choose to rape and beat and sell other men's violence as pleasure. There is a propaganda to this sex industry. Patriarchy, including capitalism, is a religion and makes common cause with other religions in that it governs with ideas and priests as well as with money and with brute force. This religion, like almost all religions, carries some of the same ideas: that women are less worthy, that women and women's sexuality must be controlled, that men are superior, and that the subjugated choose their fates, and those on the bottom choose to be on the bottom. In this most recent version of patriarchy, this neoliberal version, we have the religion-like attachment to competitive individualism, to ideas of every woman and man for himself, to ideas of greed as normal, to ideas of corporate bottom lines and gross national product as the only measure of wealth and community well-being. And we have ecological global madness at a level unprecedented. The capitalist exploitation of other women's lands and resources forced their migration from homelands in the north and the outer edges of Canada, as well as from the poorest parts of Asia and Africa, from the Caribbean and South America. Any map will show you that sex trafficking and sex tourism thrive not only on the domination of women by men, but also where the population is poor, and so poor as to be desperate. Patriarchal capitalists require governments to assist the subjugation of women and the profit-making by providing laws and policies that support both. This Harper government and each provincial government and city government, in cooperation with other patriarchal forces, has refused to protect women from violence, including by refusing to curtail the sex industry. They interfere neither with domestic prostitution nor with international trafficking of women and girls for prostitution. They repeat to us that the criminalization of women for poverty crime, this poverty crime of being prostituted, whether internationally or domestically, is a matter of law and order, and the decriminalization of the international sex industry just makes business sense. Just as individual acts of violence count, so do individual acts of resistance count. The individual testimonies of women here tell us so. The heroism of telling one's life as a victory story is of value to the rest of us. Each escapee or survivor of the sex industry who dares to speak and to speak again also creates a force of liberty. And each of us who retells that story as one of dignity and heroism helps to generate that force. The humiliation one feels in subjugation may be rendered more and more bearable in compassion, but it is utterly transformed in the solidarity of freedom-making. The humiliation one experiences in witnessing subjugation is similarly transformed by bearing witness to liberation. I accuse the patriarchy in the form of the global sex industry of colluding with individual men to overwhelm individual women in search of our safety, freedom, and security, but also of overwhelming what solidarity we have generated in our communities with nonsense business propaganda about women's choices and men's entitlements, with the defeatist propaganda about the helplessness of government to stand up for something more than ongoing exploitation, more than business. I accuse the international sex industry of overwhelming and disrespecting what democracy we have been able to win from our governments, including by breaking with the international instruments and agreements like the Palermo Accord, with which the international women's movement and the men of goodwill meant to assure each other protection of women and girls from commercial exploitation and from government neglect of women and children, and to confirm among and between ordinary people that women have a natural and chosen right to peace and freedom.